Welcome back to another Infinitum training presentation for the Boeing 777. Here we're going to discuss the procedures and techniques for changing runway on departure, on arrival or approach. We'll discuss some of the obvious risks, the techniques for handling the process and dealing with the risks, and a documented procedure that my airline uses for runway change on departure. While our pre-flight environment gets pretty hectic at times and distraction and time pressure can be rife, in the main, we do a pretty good job of managing the pre-flight to get the aircraft away from the gate and airborne safely. Our SOPs consist of a series of basically subset procedures, some of which are standalone and you get them done whenever time presents you the opportunity, but many of them have dependencies and you can't begin them without having completed a previous somehow related procedure. Look, it all gets pretty busy. Amongst all this, there are a lot of switch selections, entries into the FMC and other computers, decisions and choices made during the pre-flight that are either the direct result or are influenced by the choice of runway for departure. Since there's no discrete list of these, a change of runway requires the crew to rely on experience and judgment to identify all the changes, or at least all the critical changes that need to be made. Domestic aircraft fly regularly and enjoy runway changes during departure on a regular basis. A long-haul operation, however, can go many months without seeing a runway change after the flight deck has been established for departure. The industry data is clear. There are many recorded incidents and accidents involving runway change on departure, and we see it in the simulator all the time. A runway change checklist for departure is an effective mitigator against this risk, and that's the primary focus of this section of this training presentation. For the longest time, the checklist that I'm about to cover lived on the back of my clipboard through multiple airlines. Now it lives in our ECL. A quick word about planning for multiple runways on departure. This is not an uncommon scenario. One we see commonly is a takeoff performance limit places you in doubt of being able to depart from the shorter runway close to your parking stand, and since the final weight of the aircraft is often not confirmed until very late in the pre-flight, you might find as you close the doors that you're now going to have to taxi right round to the other side of the airport to the longer runway. When preparing for departure off two or possibly more runways, sometimes it's tempting to plan for both. That is, calculate and record takeoff performance, brief and set up the FMC, and have charts prepared for the multiple likely possibilities. In principle, it seems like a good technique, and with practice, if you do it regularly, it may even be a good approach to the problem if you regularly encounter and practice for it. However, more typically, what we see is that this technique results in at least some of the flight deck settings split between the two runways, a potential for confusion in the minds or the mindsets of the crew with respect to departure visualization and planning, and in the worst case, incorrect runway takeoff performance data in the FMC for the runway you're now headed for. Unless planning for multiple runways is a regularly practiced technique, typically the safest action in the event of a potential runway change on departure is to plan and select everything for a single most likely runway and then implement a thorough change process when the decision to accept a runway change has been made. This does not preclude pre-checking for departure performance limitations on multiple departure runways, which is always good practice when the probability of a change to a more or less limiting runway is likely. Shown here is a sample guide for implementing a checklist against changes to runway, airways clearance or takeoff performance prior to departure. In my airline, this is now an ECL checklist and can be used as a guide to implement a runway change on the flight deck or a checklist to tidy up afterwards, more typically the latter. Typically the change comes from ATC or it's picked up via the ATIS, but don't forget you might need a new airways clearance, and a change of runway typically means a new ATIS, which can have the knock-on effect of changes to your performance calculations. Hopefully your pre-flight documentation review will have considered the possibility of multiple runways, but you might need a quick look to assess the impact of any NOTAMs in terms of your new runway, your new departure, including taxiing out to that runway. In most cases, you'll need a new takeoff performance solution. That done, there'll be significant changes to the FMC. The runway change itself often requires a new SID selection, review and cross-check at a legs page, and possibly updates to your previously chosen fix and NAVRAD settings. Potentially, speed control settings on your VNAV climb page might also need consideration. It's recommended practice to rerun completely your FMC takeoff performance entry procedure from initial zero fuel weight entry all the way through to the MCP selections and VNAV performance review, or whatever your robust cross-checking procedure is to accomplish this. The stab trim will also need to be checked, and it will of course change if there's a new flap setting. Speaking of flap, depending on where this change has occurred in your departure process, this might be the time to reselect that new flap or at least confirm the previous unchanged selection. Potentially there could be MEL implications to consider, as well as a requirement to implement or cancel APU to pack or a packs off takeoff. The departure brief will need updating, ideally focusing on just the changes, but perhaps a full brief might be a better choice. And again, depending on where this occurs, rerun the departure review and the before takeoff checklist. As comprehensive as this may seem, no checklist will ever pick up all the possible changes of consequence that might occur from a runway change. Your airmanship and common sense based on experience with the first and then final line of defence against threat and risk. And these are best exercised during some quiet time between thinking you've got everything done and taking the aircraft into the air. If you have relief crew on the flight deck, offload as many of the processes as early as you can to keep the operating crew focused on the aircraft and the actual implementation of the runway change. While some of this activity can be done during taxi, particularly the things you can throw off to the relief crew, eventually you're going to have to stop the aircraft somewhere to complete the change properly. If the change occurs prior to pushback or prior to taxi, often the best reaction is to just hold position and address the problem in place. And look, sometimes all hands are on deck, but remember, with the aircraft stopped, strictly speaking, area of responsibility is based on pre-flight. While the only performance change might be to re-enter the speeds, and possibly the same speeds as you previously calculated, it's best practice to complete in full your FMC performance entry procedure, with all the reference to source documentation and cross-checking that procedure should include. Okay, let's review. Any runway change on departure carries significant risk and introduces a significant opportunity for threat and error into an already busy and risk-critical flight phase. Use a runway change guide or a runway change checklist to either implement your change or check the changes afterwards. Ideally, action as much of the change as possible while the aircraft is stationary, and use your available resources such as relief crew. Stick to using your regularly practiced pre-flight procedures to implement those changes, especially in the areas of takeoff performance calculation, cross-checking and data entry. Allow time to consider and brief the change and its impact on departure. And finally, if the option exists, consider rejecting the change and staying with your previously implemented runway. There was a time when you weren't even told what runway you were headed for at LAX, other than say 25, until on a wide base. You can make an educated guess and be right most of the time, but a pretty significant minority of the time, you were changing your runway and approach as you passed over Seal Beach on a wide base. Even now, when arriving into LAX before the east to west switchover early in the morning, it's not unusual to have one or more runway changes between 25,000 feet and 5,000 feet from runway 6 left to 6 right to 07 and back. Runway changes in this regime are simpler than runway changes on departure because they have to be. The time pressure is real, you don't have the luxury of calling a halt to the proceedings, and while in most cases the option of delay in terms of vectors and holding is a genuine possibility, eventually you're going to run low on fuel and have to make a commitment. So once again, a quick reference guide on the back of your clipboard can be a useful tool. None of the items here are particularly ingenious or inventive, but when the pressure is on, it's easy to overlook things like the implication of NOTAMs or changes in the MSA from one side of the airport to the other. Note that while Route 2 can seem like an obvious solution, it's likely you're going to have to find the next waypoint in the star transition approach that's relevant to your clearance to go direct to between activating Route 2 and then executing that change. LNAV can remain engaged during this, but sometimes it's more conservative to come out of LNAV while you sort out the FMC leaks page to everyone's satisfaction before re-engaging LNAV. As long as both crew have reviewed and validated the Route 2 setup, then the subsequent cross-checking after you've activated the route could be reduced. Finally, consider rerunning the descent checklist. Depending on your SOPs, It's how you began your setup and how you completed your descent preparations. And if you're taking on this runway change after a non-normal, particularly one that's left recalls and notes with landing performance implications, it's a whole different ballgame. Okay, so let's have a look at changing the landing runway during the approach. A runway change on approach introduces a few considerations and some additional threats, particularly in a long-haul operation with a glass flight deck, where changing the aircraft over for a different runway can be turned into quite a complex undertaking. If the option exists, it's usually the safest choice to continue onto your planned landing runway rather than accepting a late notice sidestep to a more convenient runway. Thus, unless it's a choice between a sidestep or a missed approach, serious consideration should be given to declining the sidestep landing, and even then, sometimes a missed approach might be your best choice. Most long-haul operators place a restriction on accepting runway changes or sidesteps late in the approach in order to limit exposure to what is correctly perceived to be a risky manoeuvre. Typically, an altitude well above any sidestep or circling minima is specified with a requirement to meet existing stabilisation criteria at least 1,000 feet. Depending on your SOPs, the ability to continue an unstable approach down below to 500 feet in visual conditions might or might not apply. Outside of any company requirement, unless there's a sidestep minima published on your instrument approach chart, then the runway change on approach manoeuvre must be actioned using circling approach minima, assuming the aircraft is IMC prior to this point. Sidestep minima are only published on instrument approach charts against runways that are no further than 1,200 feet apart. In principle, this allows the aircraft to continue an instrument approach in INC to the sidestep minima, achieve visual reference at or prior to that minima, and then commence the sidestep manoeuvre to land on the adjacent runway. It should be clear that in no way can stabilised approach policy be met with such a manoeuvre using the sidestep minima. Hence, many companies, particularly long-haul operators, publish the higher runway change sidestep altitude requirement previously discussed, with or without an equivalent visibility requirement, in effect turning what was a visual manoeuvre segment after an instrument approach into a visual approach to a new runway. Let's have a look at the missed approach after a runway change, and in this case specifically at Los Angeles International. So some time ago, we discussed with LA Tower and Southern California Radar Approach Control the issue of go-rounds from runway change and sidestep approaches, and in fact, go-rounds in general at KLAX, and the result was revealing. Strictly speaking, when cleared for a runway 25 right ILS approach, sidestep to land runway 25 left, any subsequent missed approach should technically follow the published missed approach for the instrument approach you just flew. So in the event of a 25 right ILS sidestep to land 25 left, then a go-round on short final of runway 25 left should be followed by the published missed approach for the 25 right ILS approach. However, the overrider in all cases will be that any go-round in KLAX, and likely any other large, busy, multi-runway airport, will quickly result in a specified heading and altitude to fly provided by ATC, and not the published instrument approach procedure. However, if it's the pilot who initiates the go-round, then you need to follow the published missed approach procedure initially, but get onto ATC as quickly as practicable to get the heading and altitude to fly. In principle, it's usually 2,000 feet and a turn away from the busy side of the airport or any conflicting traffic. One of the more common uses of sidesteps is when the outer landing runway ILS is unserviceable and the weather is such that an instrument approach is required. In this case, the ILS on the inner runway can be used with a sidestep to land on the outer runway, even as the inner runway continues to be used for departures. Think about that for a minute. Also worthy of note is that when KLAX are landing on the outer runways, for example runways 25 left and 24 right, typically all four ILS installations in that landing direction are radiating, unless one of them is no tandem serviceable. So potentially any sidestep should be to a runway radiating an ILS signal. Okay, so when is the best time to brief a runway change or sidestep procedure? And the answer is, of course, with the arrival briefing, of course. Back in cruise, before descent when time pressure was minimal. There was a time when we regularly covered the requirements, procedures and issues associated with a runway change or a sidestep, but it's become far less common as an event these days, and so we rarely brief runway changes in the arrival briefing. But even now, with some arrival briefings, such as early morning into KLAX, just before the runways change from easterly to westerly, it would be appropriate to give a runway change and or sidestep a thought. All arrival briefings into airports where multiple runways combined with historical practice imply an increased likelihood of runway changes should consider the procedures and limits for accepting runway change on final approach. Arriving into KLAX before the east-west changeover comes at times with the likelihood of landing on any of up to 3 different easterly runways for Australian from the west, or perhaps a complete change to one of the westerly runways if you're unlucky enough to be caught by the changeover. The former will result in a flight deck flurry as jet charts, FMC selections and other configuration items are shifted around for the new landing runway. The surplus of no-tamped approach minimums certainly don't help either. All of this with the same or less distance to run to the threshold. But what we're focusing on here is primarily the sidestep or runway change on final approach after the initial approach fix. The briefing items here should be clearly discussed, and having decided on a course of action, the pilot flying or captain should stick to that intention if a runway step is to be accepted, circumstances permitting. Okay, so let's look at the actual procedures and techniques for changing runway on final approach. First, the simplest and probably the least risk solution is simply to disconnect the autopilot and with visual reference to the new runway established, maneuver across to it and land. The heading correction is usually pretty small, and as long as the two runways have congruent thresholds, there's very little change required in the descent rate. Meanwhile, the pilot monitors flight path while cycling both flight directors off and putting the PM flight director back on for any missed approach. And that's doing it old style. The visual maneuver is not demanding, but some circumstances can make it so. One potential complication in KLAX, especially in times of smog and poor visibility, is the lack of electronic and possibly visual glide slope guidance onto the new runway. Especially when accepting a sidestep early, it might well be worth the effort to provide the pilot flying with an ILS signal to back up the visual maneuver. It's worth noting that to a point, the ILS signal from the original runway will provide a pretty good glide path guidance to the threshold of the new runway. This again is dependent on truly parallel thresholds and may not work elsewhere. In KLAX, that means runways 07, 24 and 25. Only runway 06 has slightly offset landing thresholds. But in the end, this glide slope guidance from the adjacent runway may become unreliable at low level and could potentially result in a glide slope deviation caution from the GPWS, so buyer beware. The provision of ILS guidance for the PF to the new landing runway can be accomplished by manually tuning the ILS or selecting the new runway in the FMC and allowing auto-tune to do its work. I must emphasize here that this information is not necessarily a recommended technique, particularly for low altitude runway changes, but it's provided for information to crew. Let's have a look and see how it works. Remember that this runway change could happen well out on the approach, long before the sidestep minima, but after becoming established and cleared for approach. So providing ILS guidance to the new runway may well be a worthwhile activity. But before we look at it, please consider the following. The ILS receiver cannot be tuned to the new runway, no matter what approach you select in the FMC, if the MCP approach mode is engaged. The MCP approach mode cannot be deselected or disengaged below 1500 feet rad-alt without first disengaging the autopilot and turning both flight directors off. Through all of this, the pilot flying must fly the plane. The pilot monitoring must monitor flight path and the pilot flying. And if you think I'm stating the obvious, clearly you haven't watched this from the back of a simulator. All that said, the actions required to provide ILS guidance to the new runway are as follows. Select departures, arrivals in the FMC and possibly next page to find the new runway and approach. Select the approach, extend the centerline, that's line select key 6 right. This action clears your existing legs page and all the waypoints prior to the FAF for your new approach, presets an appropriate centerline extension, and then displays the legs page on the CDU ready for you to review. It's likely that the active waypoint could be behind the aircraft, so bring the runway to the top and check the N-band bearing is still good. Some standard calls: runway 25 right, ILS extended, runway to the top, confirm, which will be followed by execute, and the FMC is kinda done. The ILS will auto-tune the new runway as soon as the autopilot flight director is out of approach mode. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. This can be a formidable number of keystrokes, and look, it should be practiced and reviewed, but it must be appreciated that the core action of centerline extension is actually taken regularly during vectoring to final approach. Okay, so let's see what it looks like. The following videos are provided to illustrate certain aspects of providing FMC and ILS support to a visual sidestep. They're not necessarily documenting a recommended technique, since the only way to make the animations work was to keep the autopilot engaged throughout the recording. What is shown here actually does work in the simulator and the aircraft, but again, usually just disconnecting, flying the plane manually is the best result. Equivalent manual flight actions are shown here in italics. So having been cleared for the sidestep runway change, the first action is to deselect approach mode. The autopilot flight director reverts to heading hold and vertical speed, or perhaps track hold and flight path angle, and continues down the previous approach. Engaging heading select and a small change towards the runway gets things going in the right direction. The pilot monitors and makes the necessary FMC selections and confirms and executes the change. Since the autopilot flight director is out of approach mode, the ILS auto-tunes, indicates and idents, at which point approach mode is available again. Having selected it, it's possible that minor tweaking of heading and descent rate might be required to lock up the localizer and glide slope in the FMA, but not usually. Note that when you take the autopilot flight director out of approach mode, it reverts to heading, track hold, or vertical speed and FPA as discussed. But if you do this just before an altitude that's set in the MCP altitude selector, say such as 2,000 feet in KLAX, vertical speed or FPA will capture into alt and the aircraft will level off, ruining your day. Okay, so you can see here we're set up on the ILS runway 25 left into KLAX. We've been cleared for a sidestep approach onto 25 right, and we're approaching 2,000 feet. So we'll wait until we get clear of that altitude selector. And of course, the first action was going to be disarm approach mode. That looks to be clear. We'll disarm approach mode. You'll see the FMA straight away changes to heading hold and VS, which is good. I'm going to engage heading select now and steer a few degrees off to the right, then over to the FMC, departures, arrivals, next page, 25 right ILS, extend the center line, bring the runway to the top. The QDM looks good. I'm going to execute the change. At this stage, you'll see the ILS auto-tunes the new ILS straight away. The indices look pretty good. It's idented. I'm going to engage approach mode, and that locks up pretty much straight away. Last remaining action, for no good reason, is I'm going to reset the minima, possibly clear it, or maybe I'd even reset it to the minima on the new approach, but in the end, this is a visual maneuver. You don't really need the minima. And now we're in land 3, roll out and flare, and basically it's all over. This time I'm going to leave approach mode engaged. So well before 2,000 feet, I'm going to get into the change, departures, arrivals, next page, ILS 25 right, extend the center line. Let's bring the runway to the top. We'll check the intercept course. It looks all right. Execute. And what you'll notice is we get an FMC message telling us the ILS tune has been inhibited. The ILS remains as it was previously because approach mode is engaged. It remains locked in speed, low, and glide slope, and it's tracking straight down the original ILS. Once we're clear of 2,000 feet, I can now disengage approach mode. It'll fall into heading hold and VS. You'll notice the ILS retunes, indicates, and then eventually idents. I'll now heading select, make way across to the right to provide a bit of an intercept. Again, it's not many degrees of change. Let's put it back into approach mode. You'll see it locks up in low and glide slope pretty quickly, and we're headed across towards the center line of the other approach. I guess the point here is that this method allows me to play with the FMC before 2,000 feet while I wait for, while I get clear of that altitude, so I don't end up with an altitude capture. Again, it may not be the recommended technique. Manually flying just tends to be a lot more straightforward, but look, it's provided for information. Okay, so let's do a summary. What is a pretty simple maneuver for a regularly flown domestic aircraft can be a bit of a mission on the end of a long-haul trip. The key is that if you believe you might be offered it, you might think you might even accept it, brief it ahead of time. The manually flown maneuver in and of itself is not demanding in good visual conditions. If you're not going to use the flight directors to the new threshold, turn them off and turn the pilot monitoring flight director back on for the missed approach. As discussed, FMC and ILS tuning can be sorted out without a lot of stress, particularly when accepting a change further back up the approach when it might actually be useful. But the monitoring must continue to monitor the pilot flying's maneuvering and speed and flight path while actioning the necessary changes. And be ready for that heading and altitude instruction in the event of a missed approach. See what it looks like.